I have the pleasure of announcing our very first speaker for this year's conference. Her name is Rachel Rigdon. She is going to be telling us about the quest for the Holy Grail. Rachel, hold on, give me 1 second, is the lead technical writer for SaaS documentation at SailPoint Technologies in Austin, Texas. She has, hold on 1 second. This is my first time with a clipboard. I'm a little nervous. She's a vocal advocate for centering users' needs in product and doc decisions. She loves a technical challenge and specializes in setting up docs' code systems and information architecture. Rachel is passionate about mentoring, both at work with volunteer organizations, and she's an avid traveler and amateur chef, so when you see her after she speaks, ask her about those things. All right. So without further ado, please welcome Rachel.
Thank you, appreciate it. Good morning, y'all. Am I too loud? This is my first time using a microphone like this. Thank you. I'm super excited to be kicking off Write the Docs this year by sharing some about SailPoint's quest for the Holy Grail, our desire to gather user feedback and turn it into meaningful change for our documentation, our product, and our org. Oh, this is very active. Okay, so I'm first gonna cover why user feedback is worth pursuing in the first place, and share some of our many implementation attempts and failures to gather user feedback. I'm also going to share some about a successful program we launched last year and some of the takeaways that we learned when evaluating that program recently. And then we're going to try to sum it all up and give you some guidance for if you're trying to find your own holy grail of getting user feedback and using it effectively. Oh my goodness. Okay, so first of all, why is user feedback worth pursuing? Why do we even care? Well, I think we all know that as writers, we stand in for the user to a certain extent. By going through the product, by trying to understand where users might get lost or confused, we are able to be the user by proxy and understand their challenges. But a lot of times that might just be based on vibes, and we all know that data is more compelling than vibes. And when you're able to get that kind of data and use it effectively, it can provide greater insight during your product development cycles. It can show the value that bringing docs in early into the process can provide. And it can also help guide information architecture. Like she mentioned, that's something I'm really passionate about. And so knowing how users are engaging with your documentation, where they might get stuck, allows you to make better decisions about how it's structured and published and provided. But not all user feedback is created equal. As kind of Eric mentioned, sometimes it's not very constructive, and you end up getting something that is about as useful as this admittedly delightful classic taunt. And honestly, if someone left this comment on my documentation, I wouldn't be mad, I would be thrilled. So I don't know if y'all have received similar challenging comments, but that's something that we have run into. So when I talk about the holy grail of user feedback, I mean feedback that is relevant to the documentation it's left on, is actionable, again, like Eric mentioned, and in a way that's gonna improve the documentation. If we're really fortunate, it might also improve the product and the org. So let me share some about the many attempts SailPoint has undergone to try to get user feedback. Over about a 6.5-year period, we tried a lot of things. We tried to do our docs in a community platform to get comments there. We tried to integrate with ServiceNow and our customer-facing teams, try to understand how they were engaging with customers. We even had an incentive program for support, but that ended up resulting in a large volume of trivial tickets that weren't very useful for either of us. The material theme that we use at my company, I submitted the feature request for the "Is this helpful" button, and then we didn't implement it because we were like, what is this? Is this performative? How do we respond in a way that's going to be meaningful? What do we do with that? We also explored lower tech options, forms, surveys, interviews, and a shared email box. And we just ran into consistent challenges with all of these things. And if you're interested in exploring more about different feedback implementations, if you want to share some of what your company has done, I'm hosting an unconference at, I think, table 2 at 11:15. So I'd love to hear about what y'all have experienced and if y'all have figured out a way to make these kind of methods more successful. And so some of these, this is the main reason that these implementations failed. A lot of times the methods that we were using resulted in getting generic and unactionable feedback. So, you have a shared email box and someone's just like, the docs are confusing. Which docs? Confusing how? What do I do next? There's also a challenge of a lack of clear ownership, that when we had content come in and we couldn't effectively tag or categorize it, it wasn't always clear which writer it should go to. We wanted it to go to the writer with the greatest subject matter expertise, but that wasn't always easy to figure out. We also struggled with some of the implementations, had poor notifications and triage, which could result in a user leaving a comment, and if we weren't notified, it could sit there for a while. That's not a great experience for any of us. And while we did attempt to integrate with our customer-facing teams, we struggled from a lack of cross-team support. A lot of times they were working on different goals. We might not have had the shared goals of trying to get user engagement and documentation. And, they had other priorities. And frankly, so did we. We did that 6.5-year period without comments, and that was the right call, because we knew that it was important to get it right. And we were growing our org, we were migrating systems, deepening our subject matter expertise. All of the things that we knew were going to be necessary to successfully gather and use user feedback. So that takes me to my first set of implementation takeaways. First, look for opportunities in your org, absolutely, but prioritize maturity and deepening the subject matter expertise and knowledge of your team. Make sure that as you're coming up with a system to gather user feedback, you can consider the team dynamics and what's going to be effective for your writing team based off of their resources, their risk tolerance, comfort levels, all of that. And that whatever system you build, whatever combination of tech, process, and partnership you're able to figure out, make sure it's built on acknowledgement, action, and closing the loop. So I'm gonna dig into these a little bit more. So first of all, look for opportunities, but prioritize maturity. The first question you really have to ask is my org ready? Because it's not just a doc team, right? If you get a comment and it affects the product, you have to surface that. Is your org ready to accept and use user feedback effectively? It's also important that you build partnerships with teams that have shared goals. That's going to be really critical for their engagement and for the benefits you're going to get out of it. And I think Youngji's talk after this is going to talk about that as well, on how to do that effectively, so that can be really useful. So as you look for these opportunities and you're trying to build these partnerships, make sure you're prioritizing team development, because the greater the maturity of your writing team and your org and your product, the greater ability to use feedback to affect meaningful change. It took us 6.5 years to feel like we were mature enough to come up with a program that was going to be successful. It was also important to consider team dynamics and the comfort levels and risk tolerance of your writing team. Look, a lot of us are writers because we don't necessarily want to engage directly with customers. We kind of like being behind the screen. We don't want to be support. And so how do you make sure that a system and process that you build is going to be able to manage the risk and concerns that your writing team might have? It's important to understand those and take them into consideration. And the approach that your writing team has is also really critical. At SailPoint, we have a very expansive approach to documentation. Our docs are the warranty of the product, so we have a very investigative approach. We're going to go and dig into, is this valid? Is this accurate? That's really critical. And so if that's an approach that's maybe not as developed at your organization, that might be a little more challenging for you to be able to gather and use user feedback. Because it's not enough to just get user feedback, right? That's easy. Someone's always going to want to complain. But it really matters if you're able to use it effectively. And subject matter expertise is really critical for that, to be able to evaluate, respond, and know where to target changes. And whatever system you build, acknowledge the user, make sure your process is a place that make that easy, take the action that's appropriate to the request, and ensure that you close the loop and let them know that they were heard and that their feedback was valid. All right, so I've talked about why it's important and our implementation attempts and failures. But I'm not just speaking to write the docs because we learned a lot from our failures. But last year, we were able to launch a successful program. And it all started with the coffee chat with Jordan Violet, the head of developer relations. And he was telling me about this phenomenal community that his team had built on Discourse, which is a forum software. And they had this group of incentivized users called ambassadors, SailPoint, it's got to be nautical. And they were able to support and have these super users that are actively engaged in the community. They're supporting one another and helping find answers that don't necessarily end up in the support ticket, right? Like, it's able to be a robust community helping one another. So this sounded awesome, right? Like, we had tried a community platform before that had fizzled, and we tried an incentive program, and that resulted in trivial tickets. And we tried these partnerships, but we thought, you know what? Let's try this again, remix and revise, and let's see if this is going to work. So I took the proposal to the writers, again, thinking about comfort levels and risk tolerance, since we had tried some of these methods in the past. We wanted to make sure that whatever new approach we were taking was thoughtful of what we had learned in the previous implementations. So we formed a team. We were able to move really quickly because we'd thought about this for a really, really long time. And in June of last year, we were able to launch feedback on 7,500 doc pages. And this is the tech process, and I want to talk through it very briefly just to show the decisions we made to try to address those failures that I mentioned earlier. So when we publish a doc, a corresponding topic is created in Discourse, that forum software, and it has an excerpt of the content so that the comments are always closely coupled with the content. And the only way to access this topic is through a doc link or a direct URL. This was to ensure we didn't just throw 7,500 new topics into the community, and so that we could avoid that generic and unactionable feedback we had gotten in the past. The comments are right where the content exists. The topic is then automatically categorized. This is important so that it goes to the correct doc team. Again, this kind of gets around the challenge of if everybody's looking, nobody's looking, and that ownership issue that we ran into in the past. It's then tagged with the type of feature it is. This ensures that if it's a search doc, Rebecca's concerned about it, and Stacy doesn't have to think about it. If it's Config Hub, Rebecca's off the hook, Stacy's got it. So again, this everybody's looking, nobody's looking issue, this ensured we had targeted notifications to ensure the right writer with the right subject matter expertise is notified when a user comments. And when the user comments and the writer gets that feedback, that notification, they then evaluate the request. And this proved to be a lot trickier than we anticipated. All of that preparation we had put into, we knew you were going to have to understand what the user was asking, but the evaluation process got a little trickier and human, nuanced, and needed a little bit more support. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that. Based off of however that evaluation goes, you can create a JIRA ticket straight from Discourse, take the appropriate action, whether that's updating the docs, redirecting the comment to the correct location, whatever is the correct intervention, and then close the loop. Let the user know they were heard and changes made as a result of their feedback. And this is what it looks like. You can go to any of our doc pages, and you can go to continue or start a discussion. It's going to pop you over to that community platform where you can again see that excerpt of the content, so it's very closely coupled, and that we're able to get this great, very specific feedback, create a JIRA ticket straight from there, and begin to work it and make sure the user knows they were heard. And the impact and engagement have been really phenomenal. Over about an 11-month period now of our 7,500 doc pages, we've received almost 700 comments. I checked this morning, I was really hoping we were gonna get to 700 for this presentation, so close. But the result has been of 208 tickets. And we don't create a ticket for every comment, obviously. That evaluation process, we have a pretty high bar for when we actually create a ticket. And these are not commas and links, y'all. We kind of hoped they were gonna be, but this would be really easy action, right? These are meaty, complex content and comments that we have to go and validate our documentation on, and it's tricky. And you can see that 19% of our comments come from ambassadors, those incentivized users. But then 19% of our comments, an even split here, are for users whose very first time engaging in the community is on a doc topic. So that means they went to a doc page, they thought, I have feedback, and they created an account in Discourse just to give us feedback. This shows that docs can drive engagement into the community. And this is great because partnering with developer relations showed that we had shared goals. We wanted people in the community talking and helping one another and engaging with documentation. As a result of the very successful launch, a partner, Derek Putnam, and I both received an innovation award from SailPoint. Thanks, y'all, it was nice, thanks. And you can see some of these really great interactions we've had. Here, Henrik is showing that, hey, Joshua, our writer, really embodied those pillars of acknowledgement, action, and closing the loop, and it pays off to comment. We're gonna do something when you tell us something. And that by ensuring that our content is an accurate warranty of the product, we are actively helping our users solve their problems and get around trivial support tickets. This is a compliance concern. We're a security company. This was a great win. And also, sometimes you're going to get comments that aren't necessarily about gaps in the documentation, about gaps in the product. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that too. And this is a great example where Angelo was able to raise a concern that he noticed in the product, and Graham was a hero because he escalated to the product and engineering teams, and they were able to make the change that then we reported back, closed that loop, and Angelo was able to get rid of this ugly workaround he had relied on. Now, you might think, what if I don't have a community? What if I don't have a group of incentivized super users or a forum software like Discourse? you can still get benefit from user feedback and understand how they're working with your content. The first step is to identify what tech you do have available to you, and maybe look at your customer-facing teams and what they're using to engage with customers, and build partnerships with teams that are going to have shared goals. And know that if you don't have a technology in place like a forum software, you're going to have to lean more heavily on manual processes. We all know the technology you choose has an impact on what you're able to do, and community software is intentionally meant to support that acknowledgement action closing the loop process. So if you're going to need to lean more heavily on manual process, that also requires a certain level of maturity for your org, so that's still going to be a prerequisite to gather and use user feedback effectively. That as you're doing this, you set expectations accordingly. If there are limitations in notifications or triage or anything else associated with the method that you're using, make sure you set expectations internally and externally for how you're going to manage and use that content. And always look for opportunities to remix and revise. Even with a very successful program, we are continuing to find new partnerships. And one of my colleagues, Bav, is working with our support team now so that the information they create in their knowledge base out of support tickets is being routed also to documentation. This allows us to create a holistic form of documentation, continue building partnerships with our customer-facing teams, and that does not rely on or require a community platform. So there are lots of opportunities. All right. So I've talked to you about where we failed and where we succeeded. After about 8 months, we did an evaluation of the program where we talked to the writers to try to get a sense of what's working, what's not working. Did we take your comfort levels into account accordingly? Is your risk tolerance doing okay? Did we do it right? And we came out with two main kind of things that we learned from this. And the first is that evaluation is an art. It is tricky, and I mentioned this earlier, to know how to respond and understand a user question. And it's taken a lot more time and effort than we initially thought it was going to. So if you're building a system, you're going to need to find ways to support that evaluation process. We also found that it was critical to mind the gap, kind of like that Angelo and Graham interaction. When a user identifies gaps that might be in the product or even the org, that's an opportunity for us as docs to escalate and raise those concerns so that we can feed into improvements in the product and the org. And that's the holy grail, not just documentation, but showing the value we can provide at multiple levels. So, evaluation is an art. Like I mentioned, what we get is not commas and links a lot of time. It is, can you clarify this? Is this accurate? How does this work? They get really complex. And so we have to think when we get this content in, is it about docs or is it about the product? And if so, whose product? Because we work with third-party integrations. So if I get a comment come in, I'm not always sure it's about the SailPoint product or about the AWS or Okta or Entra integration. And that really reinforces why subject matter expertise is so key. To be able to support that evaluation, you have to have enough subject matter expertise to be successful at evaluating it. So again, deepening that, maturing your team, all of those components are still very, very critical to support evaluation. So when I said earlier you need to build on 3 pillars, I was a little wrong. You need 4 pillars. I'm not an architect, but I think this would work. What you need to make sure is that the first one is evaluation. You are supporting evaluation for whatever system you're building so that then you can more effectively acknowledge and take action and close the loop. So what we did is we supported the arts of evaluation. I had to get that very lame little joke in. I couldn't help it. One of the things that we did is we brought earlier engagement from the PM and devs. We'd initially planned to engage with them at the action stage, right, where we're looking through what the appropriate steps should be. But for some of our documentation that's more tech-heavy or very code-based or just a little trickier, we pull our PM and devs in earlier in the process to help us evaluate and know the correct path. And part of this has also required greater org awareness so that the entire org understands that we have this feedback program. Writers are working directly with customers. So when Rachel comes to you with a question, it's not just because I want to improve the docs, it's because Angelo told me something needs to be fixed and we need to have some action response. It just kind of raises the visibility of those requests. One of the other things we noticed that was taking some time for the writers, that was a little frustrating for them, was that they were spending that investigative approach that we value and encourage on the evaluation stage instead of during the documentation, action, and improvement components. So one of the ways that we tried to make sure that they were having targeted investigations for improving the docs and not trying to go through Slack channels or emails or that dev I know always has answers kind of process, we had them join official workflows for customer-facing needs so that there's one single location to submit a request for feedback or information from your product and engineering teams. That way, we're not chasing around, and the writers can really make sure that they are using those investigative skills on improving the documentation. We also expanded our standard responses. We call them scripts, but basically, we provided at the beginning of this program some standard responses for if you were, it was actually about the docs, or it wasn't. If you're in the right place, wrong place, that's what we call the scripts. But we found that some of our doc sets needed more specific responses, that, some that might be a little bit trickier. When we saw recurring problems come up, we started to add even more scripts so that the writers can always go to a single location and look at what seems to be the best response, tailor it appropriately so it sounds very engaging and connected, and they can use that to, again, kind of support the art, streamline that process. We've also leaned on the community, right? I told you those incentivized users and those ambassadors have been really helpful. So when we get a comment that really isn't about the docs, but it's about the product, we're able to redirect those comments to the more appropriate place in the community where they can get help. And they do. It's wild. Like, you move a comment over, and then ambassadors jump in and other users to share how they've resolved those challenges in their own org. It's really, really fun to see that. One of my colleagues, Graham, he also is wonderful with our decision charts and visual images, and so we rely on the flowcharts that he's created to help us be successful and know what to do. All right, so the other thing we noticed, I've mentioned this a few times, sometimes users are going to notice gaps that aren't necessarily about documentation. I mean, we do get comments about, like, hey, could you add some more clarity, something's missing, absolutely. But we do get comments that are about gaps in the product, and sometimes we get comments that are about gaps in the product that could be due to organizational gaps. So kind of Conway's law that the structure internally could have some downstream effects on the decisions they're making that users might be feeling. And the doc team's not been protected from this either. In our evaluation, we discovered that there are some gaps in our own doc team that we need to address to be better at engaging with users and using it effectively. So some of the ways that we've been bridging that gap is we surface feedback to PMs and devs and our technical program managers. And this program has been in place less than a year, but we already have this quarter grooming improvements on a certain doc set that just gets a lot of questions. And so they are re-examining resource allocation so that users aren't feeling any downstream effects of some organizational gaps that might exist. This is really exciting that our team, like our colleagues, are responsive, they're listening, and they're helping us take action, and we can be part of the solution. And again, I mentioned that we had some gaps in the doc teams that we discovered where we had some shared processes but didn't have regular touch points with one another. And this could result in misunderstandings lingering, and us just not knowing those existed in the first place because we weren't having regular kind of conversations. So we recently started coffee tea chats with our documentation teams. 4 or 5 people kind of get together every month and talk about whatever. We had one last week, and we talked about what punctuation mark would you be? I said a comma. I think most people would say an exclamation mark, but I'm going to still say commas because I like them. We talked about what a biathlon is and how that came to be, Godzilla and Twin Peaks and why horses hate Becky. Anyway, all of these very casual connections means that it makes it a lot easier to connect and talk about processes that we might have that are shared. It's very much in the same spirit as that coffee tea chat that started all of this with Jordan. All right, I've talked a lot. I actually don't have any idea how long I've been talking, but let me tell you a little bit about some guidance that you might want to consider if you're trying to seek your own Holy Grail, to kind of wrap it all up. So, first of all, prioritize maturity. It's very easy to get user feedback. It's not easy to use it effectively. And the more maturity that your org has, the more maturity your doc team has, the better they will be able to evaluate and use user feedback to affect change in the docs, the product, and the org. This is critical that you consider team dynamics to ensure they're able to do that effectively and in a way that's going to build rapport and connections across gaps that might exist. And also ensure that any system builds on evaluation, acknowledgement, action, and closing the loop. Those are all critical components. Whatever method, process, tech, partnership that you end up using, these components need to be there in some capacity. and to make sure that you're minding the gap. That is an awesome opportunity to be able to raise gaps that users might be seeing to the teams that are able to make decisions to address those. So as documentarians, we don't need to focus on fixing the product, but we can be part of the solution, and we can help let our teams know when something needs to be addressed, and we need to bridge some of those gaps. I do want to take a quick moment to acknowledge everyone that was part of building the system. It was a really awesome partnership with the developer relations team, and reinforces that having a team with shared values, building those partnerships, is really, really critical. And it is part of why this was a successful program, even when our other attempts to interface and connect with customer-facing teams wasn't as effective. And of course, wonderful writers that helped us all figure it out, and support from the discourse team. All right, thank you. Appreciate y'all hearing me out. I think questions now?
Yep, we're coming.
Okay.
Bear with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, all of our lovely question askers out there in the audience. You make my job a lot easier. Okay, so here we go. First, we are wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about how you triage and prioritize the feedback that comes in.
Absolutely. So when we do that evaluation process, we really try to think, again, is it docs? Is it not docs? Do we understand the question, or do we need to redirect to an SME on the team who might be able to interpret it better? So sometimes this might be another writer or pulling in the PM devs. Once we get that evaluation process, then we know how to effectively triage. So we use JIRA tickets that we can launch straight from Discourse. And for prioritization, again, that's the evaluation piece. And if we're unsure, we pull in PM and devs to help us make sure that we're prioritizing effectively. We're very fortunate. My doc team has 10 people, so it makes it a lot easier to be able to support everything, which again kind of leans into that maturity of your doc org. Is really critical.
I'm super jealous that you have 10.
I know. We're really fortunate, y'all. I'm so grateful.
Also, it speaks volumes about the state of our various industries today that we have to consider ourselves lucky when we have a good number of people to do the amount of work that's tasked with us. Anyway, total sidebar, but I think y'all feel me. So another one that is pretty popular in the Q&A is, how do you ensure that the PMs and devs are engaged and contributing to this process? This questioner, and probably a lot of us, have major issues with engagement and responses, which impacts the team's ability to act on feedback.
1000%. We run into those challenges for sure. That's part of why we joined that official workflow, because it's very visible, and we have the business ops team. They actually triage all of those requests that come in. And by going through that official workflow that is like, hey, this is from a user, that makes it a lot easier to get their attention, because they kind of have to, and that's the official workflow they're used to. Also, again, we have a very mature doc team. The average tenure on my team is 5 years. So we know our PMs and devs, and we're kind of hard to ignore, even if we have to be very assertive, and we're pretty good at that. Again, that investigative approach is really critical. So I know it's a challenge, but when you're able also to show really successful interactions between your doc team and the end users, that is also more compelling to your PM and devs when they're able to see oh wow, they're really contributing and engaging with these users in a way that's meaningful.
Nice. I have follow-up questions. I'm having a hard time sticking to the actual questions because I'll talk to you later. Okay. Anyway, so do you have general guidelines for staff on when to respond to comments in Discourse versus waiting for a community member to chime in first?
Oh, yes. So, you mentioned those workflows. That workflow is much more complex. And what we do is we, evaluate it. And sometimes we will actually say, hey, I'm going to look into this. But while I'm looking into this, I'm going to move you over to this other category to get greater help from the community. And that way we're still engaged and we're doing our work on the back end, but we don't feel as much on the hook because the end user doesn't know all of the channels and things that we're doing to investigate. And so that way they can begin getting help from the community, which can also inform the decisions that we make moving forward.
Thank you for that. Another really important question, how did your team get upper management approval to move forward with the 4 steps, and what did the time and cost look like for that?
We were really fortunate because for 6.5 years, this was something that we really, really wanted. And my manager's manager is a former tech writer, so thank God. right? It goes a long way when you have that upper management that's suffered and felt the pain. So because this had been a priority that we had wanted for 6.5 years, it was a lot easier to kind of make that case. But also that partnership was really critical. The community already existed. It didn't cost us anything to, there was no cost or overhead to participate. That always helps. And just having that partnership and that already set up community played a role. And I know that's challenging, that it's not at every organization, but that was just one of the ways that we were able to get around it.
Yeah, it's nice to have the things that you can say, we already have the tools, right? Like, we just want to leverage them in a way that's going to be beneficial.
Yeah, and that's why looking for your customer-facing teams and the tools they're using, you can kind of hop on, and it might be an affordable way to get user feedback, even if it's less direct than the community platform process that we do.
There is a question in here about org maturity. So there was a question that you answered, which is what size is your docs team? But what also is the ratio of writers to engineers that you're dealing with?
Oof, I don't know the answer to that question. We have about 3,500 people at SailPoint, I believe, and we have very kind of targeted engineering teams. So I'm not really sure about the ratio, but I know that we're very assertive and investigative, and so we're able to find the right people to the best of our ability.
So you said, going along the same lines, that your team tends to stick around for a long time, and that you've been able to build up good relationships with your partner stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about your team's general approach? Like, what would you say to somebody who's just joining?
We actually were really fortunate that we had Bab and Graham join when we were beginning this program, and it was one of the things that made it easier to do this because we had 2 new people. And we've been able to use the feedback system as a way for them to learn and like kind of some training in that process. And so we're already training new people in how to engage and have that investigative approach, and that's just going to lend itself very naturally to how we've managed to get comments as well. So I think, a lot of it is also one of the benefits of being able to deepen their understanding as they're looking at user comments, even if they aren't the ones responding. So one of the things we do, kind of our newer writers, is we will have them do regular reviews of topics across the org so they can gain that subject matter expertise and be able to then respond more effectively.
Do you generally have them, once they've gotten the broad scope of things, like settle into individual areas, or are they kind of more like load balanced across your different subject areas?
We are, again, very fortunate that we are able to have a very embedded model where writers always are working on at least one feature product like that. They're embedded from the beginning, design, grooming, all of that. And then we have a backup model where someone has enough subject matter expertise to cover that person. Vacations are important. We want to make sure there's always extra coverage. And then we also have a ticket model so that everyone has that broad level of understanding well enough to be able to pick up almost any ticket that comes in that might be a little bit easier. And so for our newer writers, we'll try to build that generalization, general knowledge, and then when we find places where they can begin doing a more embedded approach, that's where we will direct them.
Very cool, thank you. So another question in here is, my docs are open source, like so many of ours are. How would you approach implementing this on a team who has a strong community base in GitHub already, and how does Discourse differ from GitHub issues?
There's a lot of similarities between them. Discourse, I think, has it's easier to move content between categories and the tagging and notifications. I think that's a little bit easier. It's built in. For GitHub, if you have an open source community, that's a great way to gather feedback. One thing I might recommend is trying to have structure around the kind of feedback you're soliciting. So when maybe you have a template or something where it can help you hone in on the type of information you need. But if you don't have an automated process like Discourse provides us for the categorization and tagging, that's a little bit trickier, right? Because that's part of the triage process that you want to get it to the right writer at the right time. So I mean, it's one of those challenges that I don't think GitHub has that built in the same way, from my understanding.
Yeah, I can validate that.
Okay, it's been a minute since I've worked on open source docs.
Yeah. So let's see what else. We have, how do you enforce general guidelines for staff on when to respond to comments, and does your system mirror a developer or writer first responder pattern?
Let me think about that for a sec. Could you repeat it?
So it's going along the same themes of who responds and when.
Yeah.
So do you have built into your triage system, does the developer respond? Does the writer respond? How do you avoid kind of stepping on each other?
Oh, for sure. So primarily, the developers don't get involved until we pull them in. We are the primary responders. And I mentioned the tagging. So what we have is I might be subscribed, or Stacy might be subscribed to Config Hub docs, and so she's going to be notified, but we have Rebecca only search docs. So then they know that they can evaluate and know when to pull the devs in, or when to pull in the ambassadors or the community and when to redirect. So it's very much writer first as the response, and we aim for an SLA of at least 2 to 3 days of like acknowledgement. We tend to be able to respond much faster than that, but I mean, yeah, it's very much writer first. They are focused. They get the correct notifications for the correct person, which allows us to be very, very targeted.
That's really cool. So another one here says, I love what you had to say about closing the loop and fostering ambassadors. Can you talk more about active user identification and building ambassadors? And do you do anything specifically with diversity of representation in your ambassador group?
Ooh. So we do not run the ambassador program. That is run by the developer relations team. We just get the benefits from it. And these are users or super users or partners who they get tenants that they're able to investigate, and they do get benefits from commenting in the community. So I can't speak too much to the diversity component since we're not the administrators of that program, just more the benefactors.
Gotcha.
Or recipients of the benefit. You know what I mean.
Have you had any difficulty getting users to actually leave feedback? And if so, how do you encourage that?
Y'all, we did not expect the influx of comments that we got. We thought, I mean, in the past we didn't get great comments, or either got too little or not very meaningful, but I mean, y'all saw we're almost at 700 comments, so close. And it's a lot, and yeah, no, it has not been a challenge to get feedback. Not at all.
How do you wrangle comments that should have been support tickets?
This is a common problem, and when we did the evaluation, some of the writers brought this up, that they felt like they were on the hook, and they weren't sure when it needed to be directed to support, or were we being the proxy for support, and that's a big no. We're not going to do that. So for the most part, we redirect to the community first, and then if the community can't support them, then we know that it's a support ticket. Sometimes it's clear it's a bug, but we will never default to saying it's a bug because we don't have the subject matter expertise to determine if that's accurate or not. So we almost always default to, we're gonna send you over to the discussions and questions category, see if the community can help you, and a lot of times we'll kind of keep track of how that conversation went, and then we can know if we need to suggest a support ticket.
Did you find that this process helped net increase the amount of feedback you were getting?
Absolutely. We get so much feedback, much more than we anticipated.
And along the same lines, were there any issues in scaling the process for responding to customers when more requests were piling in?
I mean, y'all saw how many tickets we created. Those 208 tickets we didn't have before this. So, I mean, it definitely increased our workload, but the quality of the tickets has made it worth it. And again, we didn't start this program until we had enough headcount, until we had enough resources, until we had the maturity to be able to handle it and triage effectively. We do lean very heavily on process so that if there is a writer's getting really mired in an interaction with a customer, we have clear exit paths for the writer and the user so that we can make sure that they're getting help and that the writer hasn't become support. That's very critical to us.
Let's see, can you share a bit about the evaluation process for comments? How do you differentiate between good and bad feedback that you receive on your docs?
Yeah, it's a little tricky. We've been very fortunate that we haven't received any kind of like negative or rude comments, really. Every once in a while someone might be a little snippy, but so far they've been very encouraging and supportive. One of the ways that we kind of determine if it's useful is our subject matter expertise, and we go and investigate. And when we finish that investigation, again, whether that's going through that centralized kind of location or talking to another SME, then we have a script. One of our responses is like, thank you for your feedback. As we make improvements to the documentation, we'll take that into consideration. It's not a lie, we will, but it allows us to kind of end that conversation when we feel like the feedback isn't actually relevant or useful. And so that's kind of what we rely on.
Yeah, like stock response for bless your heart.
Yes, and, I am from Texas, so I've used it. The goal is to either get them to the place where they're going to get the help or close the conversation in a way where they at least felt heard, even if they're not going to take action as a result of the feedback they provided.
All right, I think we are at time. Thank you so much for sharing on this topic. This was one of the ones that I was really looking forward to, so I'm super stoked that I got to be here to facilitate this.
Thank you so much.
If anyone has more questions, feel free to find Rachel. I'm sure she would love to answer them in person.
Yes, please. And I will have the unconference at 11:15. Thank y'all. Thank y'all so much.